Students, those of you that were coerced to be here and those of you that volunteered, we welcome. And our faculty, our distinguished guests, and President Perrin. As part of our week-long inauguration celebration, Dr. Stacy Patty, Director of Honors, has arranged a treat for you, a presentation on the transformed mind and the Christian University, and afterward, a panel discussion on the heritage and enduring idea of a Christian university. I'm Craig Fair, visiting professor of history, and it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Stacy Patty. No one at LCU is more tireless and diligent in their attempts to advance academic excellence at Lubbock Christian than is the university's Director of Honors. Dr. Stacy Patty is a champion of academics, a visionary who has been instrumental in the creation of the Scholars Colloquium and the Undergraduate Research Council, and yearly he has arranged for scholars of global reputation to visit our campus and present their ideas. Today's featured speaker is the latest in a long line of illustrious personages that Dr. Patty has somehow managed to bring to Lubbock Christian University. My friend, my director, Dr. Stacy Patty will introduce our speaker. Stacy.
Thank you so kindly for those thoughts. While many scholars have focused on the nature of the Christian University in recent years, only a handful stand as leading experts and key influencers in the area. Robert Benny is certainly among that small list, and we are honored to have him here today. Dr. Benny is Jordan Trexler Professor of Religion, Emeritus, and founding director of the Robert D. Benny Center for Religion and Society at Roanoke College in Virginia, where he continues as a research associate. He previously served as professor and chair of the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Roanoke for 18 years, following a 17-year tenure as professor of Church and Society at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. A native of Nebraska, Dr. Benny received his BA from Midland University near Omaha and his MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. He has been a Fulbright scholar to Germany and has done postdoctoral research at Hamburg University in Germany and at Cambridge University in England, where he continues as a visiting fellow at St. Edmund College. Dr. Benny has lectured widely in American and European universities, colleges, and seminaries, with main teaching and research interests focusing on Christian ethics, social interpretation, and the character of church-related institutions. Throughout his distinguished career, he has received Woodrow Wilson, Rockefeller, and University of Chicago fellowships, and has been named a Virginia Laureate in Religion, a Louisville Institute Fellow, and a Senior Fellow in the Lilly Faith and Learning Network. He has authored articles, editorials, and reviews for journals and newspapers, as well as 11 books, including Defining America, a Christian Critique of the American Dream, Ordinary Saints, an Introduction to the Christian Life, The Paradoxical Vision, a Public Theology for the 21st Century, and Quality with Soul, how 6 premier colleges and universities keep faith with their religious traditions. This latter book, the subject of a current faculty study reading group. Dr. Benny and his wife Joanna have been married for 53 years. They have 4 children and 7 grandchildren. When I was searching for something more personal about Dr. Benny, I turned to his longtime colleague and friend, Jerry McDermott, who writes, quote, "Bob is one of those few intellectuals who has guts. He has written more copiously and with greater insight on Christian higher education than anyone else in his denomination, yet he is not favored to speak on this subject often because he is honest about their problems and inconsistencies. And he's not afraid to say politically incorrect things about theology and politics in this era when courage is so rare. He has spoken openly in the public square on the need to retain the Christian vision of marriage and sexuality in both church and society. Although his recent book, Good and Bad Ways to Think About Religion and Politics, is one of the best ever done on the subject, no major Protestant journal has dared review it. I suspect not because of the contents of the book, which are nonpartisan but damning to both liberals and conservatives, but because he is associated with too many positions considered contrary to elite opinion. You asked about heart and character. I think courage speaks more pointedly to character and heart than nearly anything else today, especially in the academy. Bob stands out. For that, I am deeply grateful. We should all be. I personally only met Robert for the first time yesterday, but I feel like we are already good friends. Bob is a deeply committed Christian who loves his church, his academy, his family, and his Washington Nationals. He is a good man. The Rangers will beat the Nationals, should they get that far. And Professor Benny, we are so honored you're here today, and we look forward to your words. Please join me in welcoming Robert Benny.
Thank you very much, Stacy. It's a great honor and a delight to be with you, an honor to be part of this grand occasion, a week-long celebration of the inauguration of President Perrin. And I congratulate you and wish you well in your calling in the years ahead. It's always an honor for an academic to have their ideas taken seriously and for faculty to read my book and the president to say he's indebted to my thought. That is way beyond the pale. So I feel very, very honored to be here and part of this. It's a delight, too. It's always a delight to come to a college or university that intends on maintaining its Christian identity. The general story is one of secularization and gradually leaching off of one's Christian character and identity. But I have found that there are many schools that are intent on keeping that. And I congratulate this school, and even at times when it was close to death, would rather die than give up its Christian heritage. So it's a delight to be with that kind of tradition, that kind of folks. I call my speech The Transformed Mind in the Christian University. Lubbock Christian University is part of the grand ongoing Christian tradition. Its particular stream transmits a way of life, which I call ethos, a way of looking at the world, which I call vision, although I'm using vision in a different sense than the presidents used vision at the luncheon. They were talking about a kind of future purpose, clear plan that is striven toward. I'm using vision to mean the kind of intellectual Christian perspective on the world, on reality in the world. So it's a more intellectual thing that I'm talking about. I just want to clarify that at the beginning because I'll be using vision a lot. But both ethos and vision are carried by thousands of devoted members of the Churches of Christ. This university has the great resources of a vibrant religious tradition to call upon as it tries to keep its soul in the midst of enormous secularization pressures. In this lecture, however, I will concentrate on one part of the Christian tradition, vision, the biblical theological view of the world that can and should be absorbed by the students as they go through here, and called upon in their lives as students at the university to engage the claims of other fields, secular fields taught at any college or university. This focus could be a bit contentious among you because I understand the Churches of Christ tradition has been somewhat suspicious of theology in its history. Theology I define as the disciplined reflection on the biblical narrative. However, I did notice on the Bible Department's website the ample use of the term theology, so I perhaps won't be run out of here immediately. But it seems to me that the intellectual task of developing a Christian worldview or vision is essential, as well as promoting its interaction with secular claims. After all, we are enjoined to give reasons for the hope that is within us. And St. Paul tells us that we are not to be conformed to this world, but rather be transformed by the renewal of our minds. Further, since education is at the center of our mission, it seems to me that genuine engagement of the Christian intellectual tradition with the heart of the educational enterprise, the academic life, is a key to maintaining soul in Christian higher education. In the following, I will assume several things which I will not develop in detail. First, I assume that we continue to strive for quality in higher education. Some of our schools, frankly, do not rise to the level of quality, liberal arts colleges and universities, though we are far better than the ranking agencies have us. Our first obligation is to be competent in our calling to give a good education. As Luther said with regard to another calling, a Christian cobbler makes good shoes, not poor shoes with little crosses on them. Likewise, we do not offer poor education with little crosses on it. Piety cannot substitute for quality. Second, I assume that we will strive to communicate our Christian ethos as it is refracted through our particular traditions, in this case, the churches of Christ. And just in the short time I've been here, I've gotten a good sense of what that ethos feels like. An ethos is communicated by many practices like worship, like a cappella singing, which was marvelous this morning, by service, the motif of service and leadership, and vocation, dear to the hearts of Lutherans, but very alive here, one's calling as a Christian in the world. The evocation of Christian ideals in our life together. And of course, symbols and icons say a lot about a tradition, and I was ushered this morning in to the Holy of Holies, where I was able to touch the nose of John Wayne and set off the alarms as I left the library because I had touched his nose and probably carried a few molecules of his nose with me. It has risen to the status of a relic among the churches of Christ. But we indeed need religious and moral as well as intellectual practices. Third, I assume that the university is teaching the straight stuff in its Bible department. Bible, Christian theology, Christian ethics, church history, churches of Christ history, and the distinctive marks of the churches of Christ vision and ethos. It's not a religious studies department which purports to be unbiased and neutral about things without privileging the Christian vision. I think probably you privilege the Christian tradition vigorously. Fourth, I assume that we want to form thinking Christians who can deal with the modern world without losing their souls or without rejecting the truths that the world offers. We want those students to be thoughtful, critical, whole Christians, not with their Christianity compartmentalized in one little segment of their lives. In order to do that, there has to be a Christian biblical or theological vision, not only to learn, but to engage with other disciplines and to apply to real life. That vision, to mind at least, has three characteristics. It's central, it's comprehensive, and it's unsurpassable. It's central in the sense, this Christian vision, that it responds to and addresses truthfully, I believe, the perennial questions about human life and reality. Where did the world come from? Where is it going? What is the nature of human nature? We are created in the image of God. Important, very important Christian insight. What is our predicament? Our predicament is sin, not ignorance. How are we to be liberated or saved from our predicament? What is the purpose or purposes of life? How are we conduct our lives? The nature of nature, the nature of God's relation to the world, the nature of history, all of these crucial questions are addressed by the Christian vision. So we have a wonderful heritage of key answers to key questions. So the Christian vision is central. The Bible answers many of these questions directly, but in most cases, a long history of Christian thinking about this, on the Bible's answers, brings forth additional wisdom and insight. By comprehensive, I mean that the Christian vision projects a canopy of meaning over all of life, and that we as Christians try to understand and to guide our whole lives in the light of that canopy of meaning. Since God is sovereign over all life, we Christians try to understand all of life. We relate our core convictions to economics, politics, science. All of life is God's, and therefore we want to cast that canopy of meaning over it all and try to understand it. We strive for wholeness of understanding, but we know that is always an ongoing project. By unsurpassability, I mean that the Christian vision for us points accurately to ultimate truth, though we know our language and teachings are all conditioned by our finitude. Nevertheless, we believe that what we see through our vision is true. It surpasses the truth claims of competing visions such as the Marxist, pretty well dead now, except in a few elite American universities. The Freudian, again, pretty well dead. All of these thought they would bury Christianity. The Enlightenment, which is in tatters these days. or more recently, the Darwinian evolutionary view of the world inflated to a worldview, or perhaps even more threatening, because it's so persuasive, is a kind of radical environmentalism that inflates to a whole vision of life. Now, with those assumptions in mind, I would like to talk about 3 ways that Christians have evaded what I call faith learning engagement, the engagement of this Christian intellectual tradition with secular claims in all the other fields of the college or the university. Because, truth be told, Christians have avoided a lot of this kind of robust engagement with secular claims. I'm going to use the famous typology that Richard Niebuhr used, Christ against culture, or The Christ and Culture was the name of his book. And he identified 5 ways in which he believes historically Christ has been related to culture. By Christ, he means the whole Christian framework. On the one hand was Christ against culture, where there is an inexorable contradiction between the two. On the other extreme is Christ of culture, where Christianity is more or less absorbed in the enlightened culture of the day. And then the 3 great traditions in the middle, the Reformed, the Lutheran, and the Catholic. Now I'm going to take Niebuhr's Christ against culture and elaborate that a little bit, Christ of culture, elaborate that a little bit, and then I invented a category called Christ out of culture. And let's begin with the Christ against culture, the classic sectarian stance. This approach, the Christian account, cannot engage the modern academic world because that world is so fallen and distorted that any engagement with it will contaminate the Christian account. One must create an educational environment unstained by secular academic culture. One does this either by not having higher education, the Amish, or by creating schools that study only trusted religious texts, Bible schools, or by allowing only fields of learning that offer no threat to Christian claims into the academic mix. Mathematics, for example, is not much of a threat to the Christian account. Another approach in this vein is to control academic life so carefully that secular claims are not given any autonomy at all vis-a-vis Christian account. Christian claims simply slam secular fields of learning. This is perhaps the strategy of many fundamentalist schools. Avoid secular learning that may be in conflict with a tightly defined biblical vision. Some issues are simply out of bounds. Or accept only learning that has been vetted as biblical, which means relying on texts that have been constructed simply to trump secular learning. Perhaps there has been more than a whiff of this in schools associated with the Churches of Christ, but certainly not now. Such practices cut off engagement by removing the threat of culture from Christ. Another kind of evasion is what I've called the Christ out of culture strategy. By this I mean strategies of evasion in which the full Christian account of life and reality is withdrawn from engagement from secular learning, even in the midst of a Christian school. This is the vaunted 2 spheres approach. The Christian identity of the school is carried by its ethos, its Christian way of life, mostly exemplified in its extracurricular activity, its extracurricular life, and by the presence of many believing Christians in the community, and by its communal life. While the Christian vision is taught in the Bible department, there is little engagement with other secular fields. The classrooms of such schools are no different than those of a decent secular school. Christian claims are isolated in the Bible department and in extracurricular programs. This leaves the students, and the faculty for that matter, to put together for themselves all the conflicting claims of the secular fields, or to ignore or be overwhelmed by the secular claims that undermine the Christian vision. In either case, there is little faith learning engagement. The final type of non-genuine engagement is Christ of culture. This is the accommodationist approach, or that of liberal theology. Well-intentioned, it reinterprets the Christian account to make it relevant to the modern, high-toned world of elite culture. Sometimes schools accommodate to mid-American culture, which generally mean lots of football. Could it be Texas Tech? That sort of emphasis on extracurricular things like football can damage the integrity and quality of the school and can also damage its soul. But liberal theology, the kind I'm talking about, produces a guiding vision that leads the school right out the door of Christian higher education. has been demonstrated by so many schools in the Protestant mainline. Methodists, Episcopalians, Lutherans, Presbyterians have all seen their schools just slide down the scale to secularization. I know a lot about liberal theology because I was educated during its heyday at the University of Chicago Divinity School. It was there, by the way, that I first was introduced to Baptists and Disciples of Christ. You know about them, don't you? There weren't any Baptists in the part of Nebraska in which I grew up. You were either Lutheran or Catholic. So you can imagine that I thought all Baptists were like those Northern Baptists, which turned out not to be true. The dominant figures were absorbed in translating Christianity into the thought forms of Alfred North Whitehead, a mathematical philosopher, or Henry Nelson Wyman, another philosopher. And if incarnation and resurrection didn't fit into those schemes, well, so much the worse for those basic classic Christian beliefs. The laudable aim of liberal theology is to make Christianity relevant, but it often ends up in giving up specific claims of Christianity for a mess of zeitgeist pottage. James Burchell, in his account of secularization entitled The Dying of the Light, a very dark book, is fond of tracing the gradual leaching out of Christian specificity for more general, abstract, and thinner formulations in the mission statements of the colleges and universities. As a specific a Christian account, vision is relinquished, other rationales and justifications take over, and soon the Christian account no longer guides a school. In time, it is often seen as unwelcome, even as a partner in the process of education. In the Christ of culture approach of liberal theology, there's an engagement of Christ and culture, but the culture has all the trump cards. It soon wins out over Christ, has been amply demonstrated by hundreds of colleges who gradually gave up their Christian identity for the cultural account of the day. Ironically, we are in a time in history now where the culture has become so confused that it is difficult to build a philosophy of education or a mission on that cacophony. Most secular faculties cannot agree on anything, let alone a full curriculum. Now, I've talked about three different ways that you avoid the kind of Christ culture engagement that I'm talking about. The engagement of the Christian intellectual tradition with secular claims, but also the absorption of that Christian intellectual tradition in the life, the minds of students and faculty for that matter. Now, I want to move to three ways that I think the Christian account has been in lively and robust interaction engagement with secular claims. The three great magisterial traditions, Reformed, Catholic, and Lutheran, provide the Christian intellectual traditions for genuine Christ culture engagement in our schools. Most other traditions are offshoots, revisions, or mixtures of these traditions and can make use of them if they have skimpy traditions of their own. I'm looking forward to Richard Hughes's talk about whether, number one, the Churches of Christ has a skimpy intellectual tradition, and number two, whether that tradition has a model of its own for Christ culture engagement. So Richard will answer all those questions in 20 minutes. These three magisterial traditions assume that there are two poles to bring into engagement: those that arise from science, reason, imagination, and historical experience, and those that arise from revelation, as it's been reflected upon and as witnessed to in the Bible and Christian thought. All three recognize a tentative dualism in the world, but a final eschatological unity. They assume that both poles are limited by sin and finitude, so the interaction of the two is going to be pretty messy. The key question for each of these intellectual traditions is, how ought we manage this dualism on earth? This dualism between Christian revealed knowledge, as it's been thought about, and the secular claims that have arisen in the modern academic world. I'm going to deal with the Reformed first. The Reformed tradition intends to manage this dualism on earth by transforming secular knowledge into a harmonious fit with the Christian vision. Like the classic American Reformed commitment to transform society toward the kingdom of God, the Reformed vision operates in education to correct the distortions of the fallen world of secular knowledge and to make it fit with Christian truth. Worldly knowledge has to submit to the grand Reformed theological themes. Indeed, whole fields can be transformed. So some Reformed people can talk about Christian economics, Christian sociology, Christian psychology. In order to make this happen, there has to be a systematic theology that can address these fields in a very sophisticated way. The Reformed have their confessions, as well as their share of great theologians running from Calvin through Kuyper to Barth. They provide the systematic account that are the basis for transformation. Calvin College most clearly emphasizes this approach. Relying upon the Kuyperian approach of worldview analysis, Calvin assumes that all secular fields, secular claims, have implicit or explicit worldview assumptions in them. The task in a classroom at Calvin is to bring those worldview assumptions to light, to critique them, and transform them toward Christian truth. This does not happen in every class, of course, because much time must be spent learning the conventional knowledge of the day. But every faculty member must demonstrate a capacity for this kind of analysis and faith learning integration if he or she is to remain at Calvin College. Students are introduced to a rather sophisticated philosophical analysis of the foundational assumptions of every field of learning. They do not accept secular claims uncritically, and they are given confidence that the Christian worldview is indeed comprehensive, central, and unsurpassable. The Calvin student, should he or she go on to graduate school, is much less likely to be blown out of the water by secular claims that seemingly undermine Christian belief. I'm surrounded in my faculty by many, many people who were brought up Christian. When they got to graduate school, college and graduate school, they confronted these secular schemes of meaning, and it undermined what they had learned as eighth graders in Christianity, but they hadn't developed their Christian worldview enough to be able to fend off those kind of onslaughts from secular claims. Calvin students, by and large, are able to do that, and therefore they make it through unscathed. They usually come out the other end with the secular field transformed by their Christian convictions rather than their Christian convictions supplanted by the secular field. That's why Calvin graduates are such a blessing to other Christian colleges when they come as faculty. And I can say that for Roanoke College, where we have a number of Calvin graduates on our faculty. Nito. Wow, I didn't think Churches of Christ would put gin in there. No, just a joke. The Catholic tradition has a different view of the relation of revelation and reason. The Christian account based on revelation stands at the pinnacle of the knowledge pyramid. The definitive revelation of Christ is above culture, which is the phrase that Richard Niebuhr used, Christ above culture. However, the Catholics see reason more optimistically than the Reformed or the Lutheran. Reason and clarified experience are evaluated more highly in the Catholic tradition than in the Reformed or Lutheran. When reason operates properly, it uncovers truths that fit with the transcendent vision of Christianity. St. Thomas fused Aristotle and Christian revelation in such a compelling way that synthesis of faith and reason provided the Christian world's interpretation of reality for centuries. For centuries. While that synthesis was shattered by the modern world and to some extent by the Reformation, the ideal of convergence has never again been given up by Catholics. Great Catholic intellectuals still aim at synthesis. Rahner, Lanigan, or von Balthasar, the last two popes, have been major intellectuals in their own right who synthesized Christian teaching with personalist philosophies. They also take up great issues of the day from a Christian point of view. The University of Notre Dame carries this model of Christ culture engagement in its educational process. Though it does not accept secular reason uncritically, it is fairly confident that excellence in all fields will contribute to the whole picture. Somehow it will all fit together. Notre Dame seems to believe. This attitude gives it freedom to go after superior academics in many fields, whether or not they are Catholic or whether or not they are Christian. Integration is also served well by taking the Pope's encyclicals seriously in many fields of inquiry. The Pope prompts them to take Catholic concerns into account as they work in their own academic areas. As an aside, I, for one, am delighted that we have 5 Catholics on the Supreme Court, because they are more likely to connect law with its moral and religious foundations, a kind of faith-learning engagement in itself. Just parenthetically, there are no mainline Protestants on the Supreme Court for probably the first time in its history. The Lutheran approach holds faith and learning, Christ and culture in a dialectical relation. This is the heritage of St. Paul, of Augustine, of Luther, and many great Lutheran theologians up to Pannenberg and Jensen. In this approach, the Christian account and secular accounts engage each other on roughly equal grounds in the academic world, though certainly not in the church. Each takes the other seriously, tries to find areas of overlap, engages in sharp repartee on issues of disagreement, and is willing to live with unresolved conflicts after all is said and done. The Christian account may not finally jibe with secular accounts in some particulars. We may have to live with that untidiness in the intellectual world. Such may be the case with the Christian account and the Darwinian account. However, a declaration of paradox or non-resolution comes only after the end of a long conversation. Some Lutherans take the lazy approach to the paradoxical view. They simply declare a paradox at the beginning and let everybody go their own way. The Lutheran tradition has given secular learning a good deal of autonomy. It has blossomed under Lutheran auspices, both in our European Lutheran homeland and here in America. Luther, after all, was a university professor and roared, "How dare you not know what you can know?" Lutheranism has a long intellectual tradition developed from the Book of Concord as well as from Luther's voluminous writing. One can draw upon the Lutheran tradition of learning as a resource in many intellectual pursuits. I have operated with Lutheran themes in writing about economic systems, about the American dream, about politics, and Christian higher education. Lutheran themes like the distinction between law and gospel, the purpose of the church, the 2 ways that God reigns in the world, and Lutheran realism about human nature are great resources for me, as well as its radical doctrine of the grace of God in Jesus Christ. The Lutheran tradition at its best fosters a lively engagement, shies away from the word integration. That's too tidy. Faith learning engagement without necessarily wanting to transform all learning into the Christian vision, or without expecting all knowledge to converge. Valparaiso University's motto, "In thy light we see light," is a good one. We see light in secular learning in the light of God's revelation, but we also see darkness and confusion. The world, including its knowledge, will have to wait until the consummation to fit into a seamless whole. Nevertheless, we hold to the integrity of both ways of knowing and seeing things and live in hope that someday their relation will become clear. We see through a glass darkly. It is easy to think of many places where the Christian account, articulated in any of the 3 ways that we have just discussed, can engage secular accounts. A most discussed case, of course, is the relation between science and religion, particularly between the Christian account and evolution. One could also take up assumptions about human nature made in modern psychologies and sociologies. One could take up the assumptions in modern history that shy away from any schemes of meaning, whatever. One could take up business ethics from a Christian point of view. One could compare interpretations of the human condition in modern literature and film with those of the Christian. Certainly one area where such engagement would be fruitful is economics. Microeconomics runs on certain clear assumptions about human motivation that would have to be challenged from a Christian point of view. Macroeconomics assumes a utilitarian ethical framework that would also have to be challenged from a Christian point of view. It avoids questions of culture distribution and ecological effects. These disjunctions between the Christian account and the neoclassical economics offer no easy fixes. Economics as a way of understanding one key area of human life is simply too useful to reject. But we as Christians should not simply capitulate to it. Thus, we might follow Notre Dame's lead in offering courses in economic philosophy to probe these disjunctions. We might also follow their lead in requiring all business majors to take a business ethics course in which Christian moral teachings are taken seriously. In conclusion, let me reiterate what I have argued. There are covert forces of secularization, which I take to mean the marginalization of religious perspectives and practices. These forces of secularization are operating powerfully in all our colleges and universities. The best way to combat them is to find the people who are deeply embedded in the riches of a living religious tradition in both their intellectual and their practical dimensions. These persons can make the Christian vision and practices publicly relevant to all the facets of our institutional life. These persons can summon the resources of the Christian vision to engage the claims of secular learning that must be taught in our schools. In this public engagement, we hope to demonstrate to students that they need not check their Christian convictions at the door of the university, nor need they to supinely accept all that the world tells them is true. If our Christian colleges and universities genuinely keep faith with our sponsoring heritages, we will produce Christian thinking, our thinking Christians, who will go on to contribute to church and society in ways that will improve both. Then truly, our children will have faith, and our faith will have children. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bene. I think it's obvious why this man is in demand as a speaker on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. We have plenty of time for questions now, and Dr. Patty is going to roam around the audience and take your questions, and we'll ask Dr. Bene to answer them. Sir, I'm going to let you stand at the podium here, and I'll just...
You might help me pick out questioners, yeah.
Questions.
Now, the test of the coerced students and the voluntary students is whether all the coerced students leave at the Q&A time. That's what happens at Roanoke College. The ones that are required to be there, Q&A, that's time to depart. Anyway, wow, they're staying here. I forced them to by that remark. Yeah.
Well, Doctor, I think the only question I have is, in what you're saying and what you're trying to say, what would you say to the accusation that Christian universities shouldn't exist because Christians should be in academia representing, Christianity to those who are not believers, and that should be our stance, is to be in public institutions of education and witnessing that way and not kind of hiding away in our own universities?
Yeah, right. That is, we need models of education where Christianity is publicly relevant to all the facets of the school, because the general model is to eliminate those Christian practices and sentence them to extracurricular activities. So you get a lot of great universities where you have very strong Christian ministries around the periphery. Places in Virginia like William and Mary College have the wonderful ministries, but the academic life within the university is thoroughly purged of Christian meanings, and sometimes it's even unwelcome to bring them up, or even to propose a course in Christian ethics or whatever. So the general pattern is in secular universities is to sequester it into extracurricular activities, but we as Christians want to demonstrate to the world that the revelation of God in Christ, the Trinitarian faith as it were, is relevant to human learning and human life in general. So I believe it's a missionary enterprise to provide those models to the world where the light is dying in terms of the Christian meaning system in our academic life, in the secular systems. So I believe our colleges have a very important missional role to play in the larger system of academic life. And my experience now has been that the colleges that want to be most robust in their Christian identity and yet open to the world are the ones who are providing that model. The colleges that are compromising their Christian identity by hiring large numbers of faculty who are no longer believers or are not believers, those schools who I kind of prized in the book, I call them critical mass colleges, I believe are unstable and likely to slide in the secular direction. So I think those who really believe in robust Christian higher education are the ones that will provide the models in the future. But the weakness I see of many of them is that they don't see the task so much as an intellectual one. They see it one as a matter of a heart rather than the mind. So that's why I call it the thing to transform mind, because I believe we have to be armed with all the weapons of the Spirit, which means the intellectual firepower as well. I hope in the long run that Christianity will again penetrate the rest of society, not in the way that Christendom was constructed in the Middle Ages, where the church was able to kind of manage the society, but in a new way that bubbles up from the bottom, as it were, because we're living in an increasingly paganized society, I'm convinced. And so we have a mission here at home. Some of it is to plant churches and to gain believing Christians, but there's a huge task ahead to engage modern academic culture and intellectual culture, and I believe it's extremely important for Christian colleges and universities to do that, but to do it well. So not to do the kind of evading I talked about earlier. Thank you for the good question.
I have a quick question for you. There's a bubble that I see that as Christians we're living in. And that bubble is we keep things close to us that are comfortable. We're going to have to, we're going to have to bust out of that bubble. What can you see would be a way for us to bust out of that bubble so that Christianity, as we see it, can flow to everybody and not just to individual ones?
How do we get out of our bubble? Well, for most Christians, I think the bubble's already been burst, and they've been more or less overwhelmed by very widespread and deep-running secularizing tendencies. So I think it's the Barna group that talks about the tribes. And the largest tribe in America are what he calls casual Christians. And casual Christians probably wouldn't, a lot of them wouldn't be able to tell you the meaning of Easter. That's maybe extreme, but at any rate, they don't take, they identify as Christians, but they don't take themselves terribly serious as Christians. And then there's probably only about 25% that are what he calls intense Christians. Those who practice Christianity avidly, and those who know the intellectual tradition, which is increasingly important, it seems to me, and those who are willing to take a stand, as it were. Now, there's two ways you can maintain that Christian intensity by withdrawing from the world and keeping in the bubble, as you suggest. And that's this classic sectarian way to handle the world. And Niebuhr, in his book, says there's a great deal of value in that tradition, because if you get into that bubble and really are intense, say like the Amish, there's a certain witness that is made by that shows that compromise with the world what it costs to go against the world. So he's appreciative of that, but he's finally, and I agree with him heartily, in favor of what he calls the church type. And the church type, and this is Ernst Troeltsch also, the church type wants to penetrate the world. It has this Trinitarian basis of faith that God created the world, God is sovereign over the world, there is evil in the world, and Satan is active in the world, but it's this great battle going on, and Christians have to join the battle. So if we're really believing in the full Trinitarian faith, particularly the first article, God is the creator of all, the sustainer of all, the judge, the one operating through history and in our individual lives, whether we know it or not, if we believe that, operating in politics, economics, and the whole thing, then we can't withdraw into the bubble. We've got to penetrate, we have to shape, engage all those sectors of life. As Abraham Kuyper said, take every inch under the reignship of Christ. Every inch of the world should be under the reignship of Christ. And then, of course, the church's task, distinguished from the academic task. The academic task is essentially intellectual, but it has these ethos connections too. But the church's task is to evangelize and to make new Christians. And a lot of our churches lack that evangelical spirit that wants to bring the gospel to people who've never heard it before, or who have been inoculated enough by the Christian faith that they can't tell the real thing when they're confronted with it. My hypothesis is that for most of the world, the background hypothesis that humans have two destinies, heaven or hell, has pretty well been leached out. Modern people no longer think that every soul is destined to one of those two places, and that most people, if they haven't heard the gospel, are perishing. So that if you love your neighbor, and those are the destinies that your neighbor has, you want to bring the good news. And I think that underlying hypothesis more or less dissipated for mainline denominations and for most Christians. So there are a few that really intensively believe that we have eternal destinies, and if you love your neighbor, you're going to bring the gospel to them. So maybe it's that 20%. And some are gifted in bringing the gospel to other people. Others of us, like me, are more reluctant or whatever, and I like to support them by my money and dollars and things like that. But I have my own little mission enterprise, which is in the classroom, where I want to show the students the allure of the Christian account of life, how it answers these central questions. Let them decide, but I commend it to them. Everybody knows that you don't try to coerce students, because that has the rebound effect in which you're counterproductive. So you commend to them. And then I love to take up the kinds of things that they're learning in other parts of the college and engage in a dialogue with those kinds of claims, as well as faculty from the other parts of the college. One of the things I've been running at Roanoke College for about 15 years is a Faith and Reason lecture dinner. And what I do in that is invite faculty and administrators also to reflect on how their central Christian convictions, or religious convictions, some of them are not Christians, religious convictions relate to their life at the college. So we have a 5 o'clock lecture in which they're to lay that out. And then we have a reception with various kinds of libations that you people can't have at a reception, and then we have a sumptuous dinner. That always helps to bring faculty out. And then over dessert, we have that faculty member ask another faculty member to start the conversation about this faith learning engagement. And then we go on until 8 o'clock at night talking about that. And that's a way for the faculty to demonstrate this kind of faith learning engagement and encourage younger faculty who are generally reluctant to try that sort of thing. Because let's face it, most faculty have been trained in a specific area, that's their PhD. They have not had the chance to develop their theology to do that faith learning engagement. So it's a threatening thing for lots of faculty to do that. And a lot of faculty invite to do that never get to that. They tell their story. They want to tell their story. Because many people have never asked them about their spiritual story, so they tell their spiritual story. Never get to the point that I ask them to address. But nevertheless, it's a very important exercise, and it's the kind of thing that we really need. That's part of the mission, it seems to me, of a Christian college or university, is to aim at that kind of holistic engagement so that you can synthesize things and try to, as best you can, to come out with a fairly integrated view of the world, where it's not just all parcels.
Doctor, I wonder if you might address the obvious new surge with atheism. The atheists seem to be more organized and aggressive, billboards, books that are really pushed. What should Christian academia do? Should we be aggressive in return, or should we just sit by and hope for the best?
That's a very interesting question, because one of the remarkable things is a newly arising and militant, or at least aggressive, atheist secularist movement in the United States. And they're fairly well organized. And the point of it seems to be to intimidate Christians from articulating their faith in public, or even more seriously, it seems to me, to get Christians to keep their religiously formed moral values to themselves. That's what they want to do. because they believe that religiously informed moral values are heteronymous, or they are narrow-minded, bigoted sometimes. And so there's a very negative view of religiously based moral values. And there's a sharp kind of movement to intimidate this public expression of Christianity or religiously based moral values. And you couple with that kind of aggressive militant movement the general secular atmosphere that you find in academic life, where people are a little bit embarrassed to identify themselves as Christians for various reasons. The old Enlightenment model, the University of Chicago was the Enlightenment model par excellence when I went there. Besides the divinity school, in the rest of the university, the conviction was that science and reason will get you to the truth, the good, the true, and the beautiful, science and reason. And that anything based on revelation was unreliable knowledge, unreliable wisdom. And so it was pushed out from any serious consideration in the secular fields. How could you do sociology without factoring in religion? They did. How could you do psychology without factoring in? They didn't. They did do it without factoring in religious perspectives, which was counter to John Rockefeller, who established the university in good Baptist fashion. He wanted this engagement of faith and reason, and it's on the columns of the university. Like many of the universities, they're embarrassed about their mottos. The mottos were set when they were still Christian institutions, and now they're saddled with them. They don't know what to do with them. But and then the postmodern emphasis too is skeptical of Christian, particularly Christian teachings and Christian moral teachings, because they've been taught to view Christian moral teachings as hegemonic, as totalizing, and they're very skeptical about that. So you can get all that thing combined in a secular academic culture, and it takes a little courage for Christians to really speak out of their Christian convictions publicly. As I was talking earlier on, right in our part of Virginia, there's a huge difference between Virginia Tech and the University of Virginia. The University of Virginia is a more elite institution in which postmodernism has played a very important role. And if in the postmodern atmosphere, Marxists can have their say, gay and lesbians can have their say, feminists can have their say, multiculturalists, why can't Christians? So the religion department at University of Virginia will have confessing Christians publicly arguing from a Christian point of view, or publicly arguing. At Tech, still pretty much under the Enlightenment dominance as a technical school, and the humanities very much under the postmodern skepticism and suspicion, is very difficult to talk publicly about Christianity at Virginia Tech. Very different in schools, but generally speaking, I'd say there's a lot of pressure for Christians to be quiet and not exercise their values publicly. I experienced this very dramatically not too long ago. My little book called Good and Bad Ways to Think About Religion and Politics caught the eye of one of the editors of the Philadelphia Inquirer. I think he's a closet conservative because he invited me to distill my argument in Good and Bad Ways to Think About Religion and Politics and write it in an op-ed piece. And so I did that. And I think my approach is eminently reasonable. I argue in the book that churches should be reluctant to get involved too deeply in politics. But Christians as individuals and as leaders, as formed Christians, ought to be engaged heavily in politics, both as leaders and as voters, and become informed from your Christian convictions into political philosophies, develop a settled political philosophy that is expressed. So I was arguing kind of for an indirect but important and significant incursion of Christianly based moral values into politics. Well, I got my email box filled to overflowing one or 2 days after I wrote that editorial, and most of them, no, half of them were so vituperative that I didn't even answer them. And when they start calling you names, you don't want to answer. I was glad I was in Southwest Virginia, not in Philadelphia. Anyway, I didn't think they'd come to get me there. And and half of them I did answer because they were civil. And some of them were parts of militant atheist movements, and generally a libertarian cast. Now, there are Christian libertarians, political libertarian philosophy, but there are a lot of secularist libertarians, and they were atheist libertarians, and they wanted the public sphere to be completely bereft of any normative moral notions. Everything is free. So you don't have any argument on marriage. Marriage ought to be whatever people contract to, or how many, or two, or of any sex, either sex. So there was that very powerful libertarian thing, and Christians finally are not libertarians. We believe that God implanted into the creation a pattern that's called natural law, the commandments of God, or whatever, and that it's good for the society to follow those patterns. The society will flourish if we have a robust notion of marriage and we support it. There's going to be better marriage and better family life. Look at the disaster that's occurred with the breakdown of marriage and family life. Just humongous disaster. But anyway, that was one of the things that really bugged them, that Christians would shape a substantive notion of how we ought to live together. Normative notions about human patterns of interaction. They were very, very upset about that. I argue in the editorial that while most things, there's a long path between core Christian convictions and public policy. And many Christians with the same core convictions will end up differently on public policy and political ideology even. So some of my best friends are Obama supporters. I can't understand it, but they are. And they move across those steps in the argument and come to a different conclusion politically than I. And I think that's wholesome. I think it's dangerous when core political convictions always wind up in the same political direction, because you're suspicious then that the political dog is wagging the religious tail. So it's wholesome that we have this kind of, and I try to say that there's a long stage, but I said there are 3, possibly 4 things that Christians should agree upon as they move across those concentric circles from core convictions to public policy. One of them is the protection of nascent life. The second one is a safety net for all those who cannot participate productively in the society. The third one is on religious freedom, which right now I think may be the most important one. And the fourth one is on marriage and family life. Well, the one that got the most heat was the protection of nascent life. And that's a huge watershed, because the secularist atheist mentality just does not see any value in evolving life in the womb unless people subjectively want it. There's no objective basis to value. And we, of course, have a very powerful objective basis as Christians, that every developing baby is created in the image of God, loved by God, created for great things, eternal destiny, and redeemed by Christ. So we have a great, but that really sorted things out. Anyway, I had an encounter with that phase directly, and it was very bracing. Now, it seems to me that we should not overestimate the power of that secularizing testimony, because Christians are a huge group in this country, and we shouldn't go around whining because we are pretty strong. But I think the cold bath of water is that we've got to make clear that we are not going to be quiet about these things, that we're going to express them publicly, and that we are not going to be intimidated by not grounding our moral values religiously and expressing that politically. And we got to make it very clear that that's the way it's going to be. We just had at our college a symposium called "A Mormon President?" Religious and Political Perspectives. And I was one of the speakers, and I said, while there may be very many differences between classical Christianity and Mormonism, one of the things where they come together like hand in glove is religiously based moral values. And so that we were talking basically to evangelicals, because evangelicals have shown real skepticism about Mitt Romney because he's a Mormon. And I was arguing that religiously based moral values are probably much more politically relevant than differences in theology that Mormons have. Mormons are non-Trinitarian, but that is probably not terribly politically relevant. So at any rate, I think we have to be bold, and we have to do it in a civil way and in a persuasive way. I mean, we've got to show what our ground values are, why we hold them, and how we move politically with them. Not be arbitrary and just use a hammer of power, but really make the arguments. That's why maybe a Christian college and university is so important, to have citizens that not only as voters make those connections, but as active citizens make those connections and make those arguments. Very important in a democracy. We're not powerless, but we've got to be sophisticated and educated about the way we express our Christianity.
We're going to take 2 more questions.
Okay, I should be shorter in the way I talk.
Dr. Benny, I was very interested in your use of the word dialogue. I was wondering if you see much dialogue happening between the areas that you identified as Reformed Catholic and Lutheran. Mm-hmm. I think that a dialogue between Christians perhaps is not happening in the same way that it's happening in perhaps the field of atheism in other groups of people. And I would like to know how you think we can improve that dialogue.
Good question. Yes, it seems that the mainline churches are exploding and declining. And it looks like we're getting into a frayed, confusing world of many, many Christian voices not in dialogue with each other. But I think a very interesting thing is going on at our time in history, and we won't see the end of it, at least in my lifetime, is I think there's a realignment of Christianity going on, a realignment of the faith. And we're in kind of the throes, difficult throes, in which churches are splitting. The mainline churches, one after another, are splitting. Lutherans have split, Episcopalians have split, the Presbyterians are in the process. The Methodists, probably not because of the presence of world Methodism. And they can't change their teachings without consulting African brothers and sisters. And they're not likely to change on some of these religiously based moral values. So Methodists may or may not split, but there's certainly a spiritual split within Methodism. And James Davison Hunter at the University of Virginia, an evangelical sociologist, he was the one who coined the word culture wars. That's actually from the German Kulturkampf. But anyway, he talked about the culture wars in America, and he talked about the progressives and the Orthodox. And the Orthodox believe that they're unchanging truths that you can't accommodate to the culture. The progressives say that almost all truths are in process and are dynamic, and they have to be updated and accommodated to what we're discovering from science, what we're discovering from the culture. So they're willing to entertain the change of core Christian convictions. Now, one of the big issues is what's in the core and what isn't. In the warfare that we just had in the Lutheran Church, the argument was that teachings on sexuality are not in the core. And the people who left said, oh, yes, they're in the core. A couple of commandments have to do with marriage, and that marriage is a very key Christian teaching. So at any rate, the core, what's identified in the core. Wait a minute, I lost my train of thought there. What, the question again? Oh, I was talking about the realignment. And what I find, what's fascinating is that the Orthodox among Presbyterians, among Church of Christ, among Adventists, among Lutherans, the Orthodox feel a lot in common with each other. And the progressives feel a lot in common with each other. And there's a huge reshuffling going on. Now, I don't know if Churches of Christ have anything like that going on, but maybe you don't. But certainly many of the traditions in American life, Catholics kind of can avoid that to a certain extent because they have magisterial authority of the Pope and the bishops, but they got a lot of lay Catholics on the progressive side. And so the Catholics are convoluted too. But I believe that there's a purging going on, and that the Lord is kind of sorting out those who are intense about the faith, that 20% who are going to carry it forward into the future, and those who are just too compromised with the culture. In a week or so, no, next month, I'm going to a big meeting in Dallas-Fort Worth about the Orthodox, gathering of Orthodox in all the mainline denominations and in those that have split off with the mainline denominations. And they're gathering, they're going to make a statement, we're going to make a statement, I don't know what exactly it's going to be about. Social witness is one of them, political witness. But this is happening, and I think it's an exciting time, but a very messy time right now.
I just wanted to ask you how you feel specifically, because you've kind of touched on this, but the attitude that we as Christians should have when we do engage culture, because I know one thing that I personally struggle with is trying to live in the world but not be of it, and I want to make an impact on the people around me, but sometimes it is hard to get out of the bubble that we have, but also the bubble that stereotypes have created for us.
And the question is not sure what the question is.
What kind of attitude do you recommend we as Christians should have when we engage culture?
Oh, what kind of attitude? Well, certainly we should be civil. We should be willing to converse. And we have to be very, our obligation, seems to me, is to know the faith pretty well and know the Bible pretty well. That we can't do that sort of engagement without a deep reservoir of meanings and values that we can employ in that. So and again, that tosses it back to Christian higher education. Very important for people to be able to absorb this Christian view of the world, to apply it to their own lives, but then also to engage others in a confident way, but a very civil way. It does no good at all, it seems to be, insulting to people. And even with the atheists that filled my email box, I tried to be civil and engage some of them in lengthy conversations. In fact, I've almost proposed to Inquirer that I publish this engagement I had with a guy called Sean Philly, who was part of the Philadelphia atheist movement. But he was civil and I was civil, and it was a very important conversation. But it finally got down to kind of incompatible starting points. But once we reached that, there's a lot of things we could agree upon, you know. But on those incompatible, but at least we parted friends, and I think I made the arguments as best I could. So be civil. We've got to be well armed with the weapons of the Spirit. Have to civil. And probably it wouldn't help to be loving toward the neighbor. And I'm pretty sparse on that kind of resource. I'd like to have more of it than I do, but at least I can and generate enough civility. But love, that's a little bit beyond me, I'm thinking. So thank you all for the conversation.
Well, one of the things that we're celebrating, of course, is our sixth president's inauguration. But our hope is, of course, that what we're doing is launching a career that's going to be prolific at Lubbock Christian University. And the same goes for these conversations. The hope is that with these discussions that we have, it's not something that ends when this discussion or when this lecture ends, but it's something that will create dialogue. I think that's one of the points that Dr. Bennett was making, and that we'll continue to ask questions of each other and sharpen our minds and our Christianity by continuing a conversation. To that end, we are actually going to have a panel meet and discuss with us at 4 o'clock, but we have a few minutes before then. We'd like to set things up. We also have water and coffee in the back for you. Could we have one more round of applause? And then we'll see you back at 4 o'clock.